Lords and ladies, by the gods, did we not get something out of left field the other night? And I'm a little bit blown away that it came at the date that it did, but hey, I'll take it. I think you will too. But this was a very, very nice release date trailer, and it has a bit of the old, but also a fair bit of the new, and we're going to be breaking that all down and analyzing it as is customary. But at the very outset, let me say that one thing that's patently obvious about the trailer is that the graphics have been massively overhauled and updated. And by the way, this was taken from a PS5, i.e. a thing made for console peasants. No offense, but think about that. PS5 already looks so much better than Early Access ever has. Everything is crisper. The UI looks very, very different. So for example, you can see in character creation that the UI looks different. You can see in the game that the UI looks different. The reference to the characters involved, it notes the class and level, and that's probably not even the finished version. So right off the bat, you notice different things, mostly graphical and UI-wise.
Which tells us that many of the people who were afraid that the game wasn't going to be improved in any noticeable way, they can now be allayed of these fears.
Because a lot of people didn't think that the real McCoy of the game was going to be all that different from Early Access. But it does look very different. Almost everything has been overhauled graphically from what I could see in the trailer, and that's a really nice thing. But what we're really interested in is all the new stuff that's been offered. And of course, there's a huge new thing that we will be talking about, Kethoric Thorm, but there are also several other new things that are important to talk about too. We're going to be breaking it all down here. Let's launch into it. The first new thing we see is this completely redone, graphically speaking, stone effigy at the beginning of the game. The details are better, crisper. It depicts what appears to be a bunch of thralls worshipping or in a state of awe before an illithid and what is probably the elder brain. And it is a good testament to the fact that yes, already we see huge graphical improvements, and presumably the footage we saw was not even complete footage. So there you go. So right off the bat, very important detail. In and of itself, nothing new, but nonetheless we can see, look how good the graphics have become. And here we have the very first instance of what's probably the biggest news in the trailer, and that is none other than Kethoric Thorm. Now, the first time we hear about Kethoric Thorm, it is from Halsin, the druid, and we hear about him in the sense of him being a dark justiciar of Shar, and how he created the Shadowlands, which I've speculated is an extension of the Shadowfell, or at the very least, heavily influenced by the Shadowfell. But Kethoric Thorm is a huge, huge mystery, for a number of reasons.
But right off the bat, let's get the obvious out of the way. He's obviously an older half-elf. He has pointy ears, he has a beard, and he looks to be on the older side. That's not particularly mysterious, and also not particularly interesting. The only thing I would say that's interesting about this is, given that he is basically a general of the Absolute, the images that we had received thus far were a little bit misleading because they didn't give us a proper outline of what he looked like. And now back to the mysterious stuff.
Supposedly, because the trailer reveal of him as a person is not a revelation of what his motivations are specifically, whom he serves, why he looks the certain way he looks, and we'll talk about his armor in a bit, or what his plans are.
It's simply revealing something that we, the viewers, have to disentangle.
Now, you might recall the scene, if you go far enough into Early Access, near the Goblin Camp, where the party is forced upon its knees by the Absolute. And the Githyanki artifact that Shadowheart carries protects you from this. But during that cutscene, you'll see three different figures who are the Absolute's generals, and the central one is clearly Kethoric Thorm based upon the armor. It very much looks like the same individual. Now in Ketheric's armor and in his surroundings, we can see a lot of death iconography. We can see skulls everywhere. And this begs the question, why?
Now a cheesy and incomplete answer might be, well, skulls are gloomy and dark and Kethoric Thorm is going all goth on us. But obviously that's not a good answer.
Because based on the limited knowledge we do have about Kethoric Thorm, he serves Shar. And the goddess Shar is not obsessed with death. she's obsessed with oblivion. Now, you could conflate the two and say, well, oblivion, death, pretty much the same thing. No, and certainly not the case in the Forgotten Realms fantasy setting. We have had many gods of the dead. We have had Jurgle, we've had Merkel, and now we have Kelemvor, and they reign over the dead. So to exist in a state of death, whether it's undeath or being dead, means that you fall within the province of the respective god of the dead. Why the skulls then? What do the skulls mean? Well, here all we can do is offer some speculation. It's informed speculation, but I cannot promise you that it's in fact true. So here goes my informed speculation. We have been told ad nauseum that the core of the story of Baldur's Gate 3 involves a complot
orchestrated and directed by the Dead Three,
namely Bane, Merkel, and Baal. Yet by now we know that Shar is also an ever-present feature of the game. She's an important goddess in the setting, and she's equally important in the game. I think the evidence for that is compelling. So what is Kethoric Thorm's involvement if he is a henchman, or general, if you will, for the Absolute? The Absolute is somehow related to the Dead Three, and yet at some point in time, he was a Dark Justiciar, i.e. a servant of Shar.
Now, I basically have two ideas, and the first idea of the two is the one that I consider significantly more plausible. So I will start with that idea. Scattered throughout Baldur's Gate 3 Early Access, you can find various notes on and allusions to none other than Kethoric Thorm. In fact, there is a book wherein it is stated that Kethoric Thorm, who openly here talks about the tragedy that befell him, was pushed to the dark side, i.e., he might have been a believer in Selûne even at some point in time, and was pushed to the worship of Shar. Okay, so far so good. There's also evidence that he fell out of favor with Shar for a variety of speculative reasons. We don't know the exact reason, but I think it's very likely that he no longer sports the favor of Shar, and no longer actively worships her. And it's quite possible that Shar herself has rejected Kethoric Thorm. Well, where has he found his source of power? Probably, almost certainly, from the Dead Three. Supposedly, he's invincible, according to statements made by Jaheira in the trailer. Now, given the prevalence of all the skulls and necrotic magic he wields and everything just related to death, the fact that he talks about death, that would really make me think of Merkel. Merkel's former title was the Lord of Bones. He was the patron of necromancers, and he was just as much a lord of the undead as he was a steward of the dead when he was still a god. I think that's probably what has happened, that Kethoric Thorm has found favor vis-a-vis the Absolute, i.e. the Dead Three, and his personal patron is Merkel, because again, all the skulls. Now the skulls, in terms of their iconography, do not resemble the old symbol of Merkel perfectly, but it's the only explanation that makes sense to me. He seems to revere death. He states that death's design will be complete. And again, it could be a reference to Baal, but I'm getting much more of a Merkel vibe here. So I think probably he has become a servant of Merkel and a general of the Absolute, which is just a figurehead for the Dead Three. Probably. That's the first theory.
Theory number two, again speculative,
and also the theory, which I've already mentioned, I personally find less plausible, but I feel necessary to mention,
is that we're told that the Dead Three are behind the plot in Baldur's Gate 3.
But that's only part of the story.
Because here's the thing. We also know that the Dead Three have been reduced to the status of quasi-deities. They are not fully divine, nor are they fully immortal, and therefore they lack power. They certainly lack the power in their current form of a fully fledged deity, and they might be attempting to return to divinity. Now, oftentimes what happens in the Forgotten Realms, historically speaking, is that you might have a mortal seeking godhood, and a deity will step in and act as a patron to usher him into divinity. This has happened many times over. There was once a god of necromancy and lichess called Velsharoon, and his patron was Talos the Destroyer, the god of storms and destruction, who provided him information to allow him to ascend to godhood. There's the god Azuth, who is the god of wizards, not of magic, the god of wizards and spells, and his patron, it shouldn't surprise you, was Mistra. Yet another example is Torm the True, the god of duty and loyalty, who was once a mortal many, many millennia ago. And he was sponsored to godhood by Tyr, the god of justice. So This is not an unusual thing, at least hypothetically. And Shar is an incredibly powerful goddess, next to Mystra, perhaps the most powerful. And so it could be that the Dead Three, in their quasi-deific state, are now working for Shar, as her henchmen, as it were, in an effort to regain their divinity, but nonetheless carrying out the plans of Shar. In this theory, Kethoric Thorm is indirectly serving Shar by serving Merkel, because of the imagery and iconography. Skulls everywhere, a heavy influence of the dead, as well as the undead. And so it could be that Shar is ultimately behind the plot of everything, and the Dead Three are simply her tools. This would not be the first time, by the way, that Shar has manipulated people, and specifically even other gods, to do her bidding. Mystra was murdered once by the god Cyric, the god of lies. But Cyric was cajoled and convinced to do so by Shar. Cyric, who at the time was quite a powerful deity, was nonetheless manipulated by Shar into committing this act.
And we know that Shar plays a big role in the game. Now, for the record, again, I think this theory is much less plausible than the previous theory, because I think ultimately that Kethoric Thorm has fallen out of favor with Shar, and serves the Dead Three as an alternative. I also don't believe that the Dead Three, Bane, Merkel, and Baal, would subordinate themselves to Shar, because in life, and in death, and in godhood, all three of them were incredibly arrogant. Remember, Bane and Merkel single-handedly ushered in the time of troubles, the great reckoning that realigned the power of the gods throughout the realms by the hand of Eu, the overgod. So I don't think this is very likely, but I nonetheless thought it was important to throw that out there as a possibility. So I'm largely sticking with the idea that Kethoric Thorm has lost favor with Shar, fallen out of favor with Shar, and serves the Dead Three, i.e. Merkel, and that is what is going on.
And here we have some new scene involving death, presumably, a skull. Again, much of this is reminiscent of Merkel, but the iconography is not identical to that of Merkel's, and so it's a bit confusing. There appear to be undead guardians around the site, and it looks like it's probably some kind of ritual site if I had to hazard a guess. There appear to be pods, but the pods don't resemble the pods that birth Illithid, so who knows exactly what their purpose is here. Now here we see a dark fortress, which, based upon the imagery, looks to be in the Shadowed Lands, or the Shadowfell, as I've suggested. And we've seen this before, only now we know, as evidenced by the trailer, that this is probably the fortress of Kethoric Thorm himself. He is its overlord. Another scene with Kethoric Thorm sitting on his throne, being attended by what appears to be a half-orc servitor, and Kethoric Thorm is offering an audience to goblins. There appears to be, in addition to this, some priest-like figure holding a staff on the left hand of the image, and we don't know exactly who or what that is. But clearly, based upon this, we know that Kethoric Thorm is most definitely in a position of power. And here Kethoric Thorm, again, seated on his throne, with his undead hound in tow, and impossible to miss, skulls everywhere, death, death, death. Again, very reminiscent of Merkel, much less so of Shar.
And I've already offered a plausible theory for this.
Here we have Gale running through some corridor, and it's a good demonstration of the different UI. We can see at the bottom left-hand corner, it states very clearly, Gale, level 8, human, wizard. That is not something currently present in early access. And the area where Gale is running about is also new. We've not seen this to date. But I can tell you something that we do see here that we saw to some degree in the previous trailer. Some very interesting symbolism and iconography of what is almost certainly a certain god, a very ancient god. And here we can probably see better evidence for this god than anywhere else hitherto. And that god is a Minotaur, the ancient Netherese god of the law and the sun. And here we see some very, very convincing sun iconography that doesn't perfectly resemble the traditional symbol of a Minotaur, but is similar enough. And as I've mentioned previously, the Minotaur plays a minor role in Baldur's Gate 2, for those of you who have not played the game. And so it's perfectly conceivable to me, given this solar iconography, that a Minotaur might play a role as well in Baldur's Gate 3. Alternatively, the iconography could also be iconography of the god Lathander, the god of dawn, hope, and creativity. It's impossible to tell based on limited images here. Could go either way. Based on the general vibe of the place, I would say this is a temple of Lathander. And here we have a very good example of new features in the game and the new UI. It's the character creator. We have a dwarf here, and it gives you the option to customize your character. And what's very important here, something that people were asking about, is body type, right? There was a situation in early access where you wanted to play a big, burly barbarian, and they were really scrawny. But here it appears to be that you have at least two choices, based on what we can see body type 2, and if I were to venture to guess, maybe even 3 or 4. So that's very nice. The character creator looks different, and I'm looking forward to playing around with it come release. And here we have Gale casting some type of spell. It appears to be a fireball, but more importantly, these creatures that are featured in the image are sporting a condition called unstable. Whether or not that's an inherent condition in the game or only applicable to the creatures in question is anyone's guess, but it's something we haven't seen so far. As for the creatures themselves, I'm running the bestiary through my mind, and nothing comes to mind in specific. Of course, I don't know everything about D&D, so it could just be that I am drawing blanks. So if you know exactly what these creatures are, do let us know. And here we have what appears to be the entry to the same temple that I mentioned before. Possibly a temple to Lathander or Monitor, or perhaps a different deity entirely. Here we have an Asmodeus Tiefling Paladin. Again, the new UI being displayed prominently. And here we have a very interesting image, to my mind, something completely new, and that is some ghostly manifestation of an Illithid and the player character. And it's all ensconced in shadows, there's mist, and we also see a red cap in the bottom left-hand corner. And I can only interpret this, but I don't actually believe this is a real Illithid coming out to attack the player character. I think this might be related to the fact that the tadpole is being carried in your brain, and it could represent the consequence of overusing your tadpole powers. Because even though the Illithid does not look to be corporeal, like I said, it looks phantasmal, ghostly, its intentions towards the player character do not seem to be positive. It looks like it is out to get the player character, as it were. So, doesn't look like a good thing, but again, if I had to hazard a guess, it might be related to the overuse of the tadpole-based powers. And what we have here is a very cool new gameplay feature, it appears to be, and that is a druid transforming into none other than a displacer beast. And I'm just thinking, how on earth is that possible? And technically this shouldn't be possible for a number of reasons, because according to the rules, druids can transform into natural animals. And a displacer beast is not a natural animal, it is a monstrosity, it is a monster. So very strange. But don't get me wrong, I think displacer beasts are quite cool, and being able to transform into one is even cooler. But then there's also the question, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, that it's only a level 4 druid. A level 4 druid transforming into a displacer beast? How is this even possible? What am I missing here? And obviously we don't know the details, but it is very cool. And if you in the audience have an explanation for why a level 4 druid can transform into a displacer beast, maybe I'm missing something, do let us know, but a very cool thing indeed. And here we have a level 5 Low-Sworn Drow rogue called Elisanda, facing off against minions of the Absolute. We have a foot soldier in the front, and what appear to be clerics, or possibly mages of some kind in the back. Obviously, we can see the iconography, the symbolism, definitely the Absolute, and she is manifesting an Illithid power in this case. And you can acquire this power by telling Umulum, the Illithid in the Underdark, about the condition you have about the parasite. So that isn't in itself anything new, but here we can see at the very least minions of the Absolute that we have not yet fought. And another thing to point out here is the fact that the character is only level 5. She's only level 5, but she's already facing obvious minions of the Absolute, which tells me that this is probably Chapter 1 still, and, as Larian has alluded to, it is quite different from early access in terms, in this case, of the enemies we face. And here we have another big reveal, what appears to be a half-elf cleric of Selûne.
The symbols and iconography are clear, you can see on the armor. She is definitely at the very least a servant, if not a cleric of Selûne, and she's talking about the danger that Kethoric Thorm represents and how you might be able to overcome it. So now we actually have a mouthpiece, as it were, a spokesperson for the Church of Selûne. Up until now, we've seen a lot of, again, iconography, symbols, statues, what have you, tons and tons and tons of hints and indications that Selûne will play a large role in the game, but now we have an actual servant of Selûne speaking to us. In this case, I guess it's Gale, and she's giving us the lowdown on Kethoric Thorm, which tells me that the Church of Selûne obviously has had its conflict with Kethoric Thorm and Shar, absolutely to be expected given the fact that the sisters Shar and Selûne have been fighting each other since literally the inception of the existence of Toril itself. Who she is specifically, I don't know, but she's probably somebody important. Definitely a servant of Selûne, looks to be a cleric. Some nice imagery of the party atop the Dark Tower, of which Kethoric Thorm is probably Overlord, with the updated graphics. We have Lizelle, of course, we have Will, we have Gale, and we have Shadowheart at the front. And rather conspicuously, Shadowheart is wearing the Dark Justiciar armor of Shar, which is a nice touch, and it really makes me wonder what the relationship of Shadowheart might be to somebody like Kethoric Thorm, especially considering that he might be an apostate of Shar. Either he has forsaken Shar or Shar has forsaken him. I guess we'll find out. But we can see that this armor will be available for us to wear, and it looks quite cool on her. I think it's very fitting. This isn't something necessarily completely new, but the scene itself, I believe, is, because Shadowheart is looking at the Githyanki artifact and musing over it in a way that has not yet been shown to us in early access. So it is something new, and it appears to be at least slightly activating in her hand. It's not entirely clear. So that's something new. And here we have the beginning of several scenes of what appears to be a final showdown between the party and Kethoric Thorm. The party is level 8, as indicated by Shadowheart's level, and this begs the question as to whether or not level 8 is the level that is associated with finishing Act 1, because this final showdown imagery is very reminiscent of finishing the act to me. We know that we're going to be facing off against Kethoric Thorm. We've been informed of it by Halsin, so it could be that level 8 is the level we finish off on when we finish Chapter 1. And since level progression becomes more and more difficult as you gain more levels, this seems perfectly plausible to me. So if I had to hazard a guess based upon this, I could easily see something like 3 chapters, and in Chapter 2, you go from something like level 8 to level 12, and in Chapter 3, you go from something like level 12 to level 15. If I had to hazard a guess, that's what I would say. And during the showdown, you can see, again, a lot of death, and Kethoric Thorm manifesting necrotic powers, fighting the PCs, and clearly he is an emissary of death. He's associated with death. He has a lot to do with death. Now, in addition to the release date trailer, Larian has also provided a trailer featuring the voice actor of Kethoric Thorm, namely J.K. Simmons, a fairly famous actor of no small repute. And we can also see some imagery. Nothing especially new per se, but again, here we can see the manifestation of the power of the Shadowfell. We see this statue, which I've alluded to before in a previous video, of a priest or a follower of Selûne that is now either petrified or it's just a statue perhaps, but we see the outward manifestation of death pretty much everywhere you look. The skulls, yet again, and you also receive an explanation to some degree of the story behind the character of Kethoric Thorm and why he became what he is. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the breakdown of this release date trailer, but I fully plan on making videos about topics that came up during the release trailer, namely Kethoric Thorm, among others. So as always, thank you very much indeed for watching, and if you like my content, please hit the like button, comment, share, subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Really appreciate it, and I will check you out next time. Everyone take care. Bye-bye for now.